Welcome, everyone. Thank you to coming to Office Hours, a program where we invite luminaries from the software world to share insights. These are one-on-one sessions with experts, and they've been a huge success. I'm Lauren Demuse, partner and COO at Theory Ventures, and I'm delighted to introduce our discussion today. We'll sit in a fireside chat format for about 40 minutes, weaving in the questions you submitted in advance, but please feel free to ask questions as well in the chat box and on the YouTube page, and we'll try to address them. Tomasz is a general partner at Theory Ventures, our $230 million fund focused on early stage companies leveraging technical discontinuities into go-to-market advantages. And prior to founding Theory, Tom spent about 14 years at Redpoint as general partner, making investments in Looker, Expensify, Monte Carlo, and Customer. And today we're joined by Philip Zelitchenko, who's a seasoned data executive. He's currently vice president of data and analytics at ZoomInfo and owns a wide breadth of responsibilities across the enterprise, including data platform, data engineering, analytics, data science, machine learning, data governance, and data product management. Beyond ZoomInfo, he's an active advisor to other data and AI companies and is an investor as a part of IID, which is Invest in Data, a firm that provides a vehicle for data executives to invest in promising data companies. And prior to ZoomInfo, Philip was a senior data leader at other companies in the Valley like DocuSign and LeadSpace. So through this leadership and his experiences with data teams, Philip has a unique management approach to running his teams, like a standard product software development function. And we're going to get to probe those today. So with that, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Lauren. Philip, such a pleasure to have you on. We really appreciate it. When we chatted last, one of the things that really sparked in our conversation was this idea that you are running your data team like a product management team. And it was the first time I'd spoken to a data executive who's doing it this way. So the reason I asked you on the show is to talk about this in more detail, because we believe in a decade of data, which I think will be much longer. And we believe that data teams are becoming and converging this and looking more like software engineering teams. It was fascinating to talk to somebody who's actually doing it. So I'd love for you, if you wouldn't mind, just talking a bit about the history of how it is that you came to build or structure your data team in the same way as a software engineering team. How did that idea come to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Clarification. So the areas of which I'm responsible at ZoomInfo is on the enterprise side. So basically everything related to corporate. And the idea came from reading Marty Kagan's books. Big fan of Marty Kagan. I think the approach of thinking about things as products is an important approach. And I think in the data world, that practice has not been worked on for a long time. And I think that's why the concept of data products has made it very curious for me to dive into. I think the idea came from the fact that I know that at the end of the day, we have a certain set of people that work on problems in the data world. There's different data practitioners that reside in the org. It doesn't matter if you have a centralized org, a hub-spoke model, or a hybrid approach, or anything in between. And these resources are doing work for the company. These resources are being utilized for different functions, different products, different insights that are trying to drive. And one of the things that I ask myself all the time when I look at this is I'm trying to measure the real value that I provide to the business. I care about that. I don't want to spend my time on things that we're doing transactionally just to fill some requirement, because the productivity of the team and the impact that it has for a public company like ZoomInfo is important. If you start thinking about it, then you look at the work that you're doing, because everyone steps at a certain stage to a company and sees the work that's being done, unless you start your own company, and you try to evaluate what is that impact that you provide. And then you ask yourself, one way to measure impact is, what happens if I turn something off? How does it impact others? And that's one way to do it. Not the most optimal way, but it is a way to do it. The other way is to try to understand what is the value of the data product that you built, these insights that you generate. And in many cases, and I think the tech stack, and just to give you maybe a step on the mental model that I like to use a lot, there's people, process, product, and tech stack. The way I see it is, at the end of the day, in the tech stack, you generate insights that are being utilized across the org. And then you ask yourself, what are these insights and how do they impact the company? And what you learned looking at the tech stack and looking at Snowflake, for example, or any other data warehouse, or you look at your visualization layer and what lives there, is you learn that at the end of the day, it's sort of long-term with a long-tail distribution of things that haven't been touched in years, things that were built and are not being utilized. And all of those, I think, is a proxy to that in a lot of these cases, not in all, this is perceived value that was provided for the business, not real value that is long-term value that can build a company up. And
Okay, so what you're saying is, so you read these Marty Kagan books. You think about data as a product, and the most important outcome of a product is the value that you create. And if you think about classic BI, the long tail of Excel spreadsheets, people often think that there's value there, but in reality, there's not as much value as one might believe. Is that right?
yeah, the value is there, but it's mostly transactional. And I think if you're trying to build something for the long term, which I think every company is trying to aim for, then you would like to find ways to take these long tail insights that you're trying to build and try to think about the data product that will be the operating system that people use on a daily basis to make decisions, and not think about I need something right now for the specific campaign and marketing. I don't need this now from a financial perspective to learn about certain optimization that I'm trying to do. But how do I build a framework that allows me, or a data product that allows me and my team to operate more efficiently, either at the IC level or the managerial level?
Makes sense. Okay, so in a world where we work at a big public company and everyone is analyzing data using Excel spreadsheets, and the data team is outputting those Excel spreadsheets, that's like a consulting company. Each project is bespoke. There's no leverage. There's no ultimate value that's being built. There's no intellectual property. There's no repeatable process aside from the individual Excel spreadsheets. And so what you're talking about is this shift to how do we architect something that the key part of the workflow for the rest of the company where it produces value. Is that right?
Correct. And I think in a lot of these cases, there's also misalignment, right? If you think about all the time, and I think the graveyard in Tableau or the graveyard in Snowflake just shows you how much effort is being spent on things that might never be touched again or weren't touched at all. And these are efforts of data practitioners, and we can talk about like the participants of that data practitioner group that I'm describing, sitting and spending weeks or days to build Tableau dashboards, Excel worksheets, or they try to build APIs and endpoints or DAGs or batch processes, all to try to answer something. But in a lot of these cases, there's no one on the other end to receive it, or there's no standard, or there's no process in place, and the people are not equipped to use these products. Because if you think about a product, let's move out of the data world for a second. Think about the customer at the end who's going to be utilizing, how they're going to be utilizing it. It's not something that is transactional. And I think the approach in data is a lot of wasted resources that go to a transactional value.
Yeah. So my mental model while you're talking about it was, if I take a look at a GitHub repo for a software product, I'm at like 95% or more of that code base is on the critical path of it's being executed as code a lot with some frequency, right?
Yeah.
And then I think about my own repository and all the individual notebooks that are there. And the reality is like only one or two of those is ever executed. And if I think about big Snowflake, we were talking to another data leader, they have this policy where if a Snowflake table isn't touched for 30 days, it's deleted. And she ran through this, and it turned out to be a lot of data that's actually being deleted, where it's sort of this dead end code. It's not actually being used. It's not actually valuable to the customer. And so what you're saying is the data world needs to look more like the software world, because there's a lot of wasted effort that's not repeatable and not valuable to anybody. Is that right?
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying that the approach currently is an approach, but if we think about productivity and impact and what's the real impact, the marginal real impact that I put my efforts to, we want to make sure that that is a long-standing impact and it plugs into some framework that the company can. I think of the data as the backbone of how we operate a company. And if we want to align people and processes around some product that everyone can look at and say, this is the direction we're going, this is how we evaluate the impact, that's the business value that it's providing, and we have a way to measure ourselves, and it's a standardized framework that everyone follows, then it's easier to align people and processes around it. Because in a lot of cases, I think the biggest one is the people and processes spending time on things that are not important, not standardized, or going 5 different directions.
Makes a ton of sense. So how do you go from a world of not very organized to much more organized? How do you structure, maybe we can start with the team. How do you structure your team?
That's a good question. I don't claim that I've solved it. I have ideas that we're working on and we're executing, we're learning a lot of assumptions. The scientific method is there all the time. We try things and we fail and we try again and we build those up. Let's talk about the team in ZoomInfo. The team in ZoomInfo is built out of, I would say, about 5 teams. There's the data product management team. That's basically the quarterback for everything that we do. We have a great leader. His name is Ronnie. He's and his team are looking at all the efforts that we're going through and trying to understand basically writing those PRDs. And in our world, it's called DPRDs, but it's the same thing. Is you're trying to do something with data. You're to create an application. You're trying to create some change in the business in some sense. What are you trying to get? And what happens in that DPRD is we try to collect all the requirements of what value we're trying to drive and talk to the stakeholders, to our customers. And a lot of our customers are internal. So we have people on the marketing side, with people on the sales side. We can talk about the go-to-market versus product side of the org in a second, but we have these customers across the org, and we try to collect these requirements as much as we can, and we think about the end product of what we're trying to deliver. At the end of the day, that end product is the thing that is driving the value. So that's the function of the DPS, and that's what we're trying to build with them. Again, all in build stage. We have some good practices in place. We're still building the other practices. That's the DPM side.
Okay, one question there. So are they responsible for both internal PRDs and external PRDs? Your data company, you sell data.
Yeah.
Are they responsible for external data product PRDs, or is that a different team?
No, different team. We're split. So we're focused on the enterprise side. There's a team that leads these efforts from a product perspective under the CPO, doing an amazing job, but separate from ours.
Awesome. Okay, so you have your data PMs. That's the first of the 5 teams. What's the second?
So the second one, and I'm trying to think of how to tell a story, but we can talk about it from top to bottom. The DPMs are the quarterbacks. They play a big role in making sure that we as an org operate properly, that we follow, that we understand what's being asked from us, that we know how to prioritize it, that we know how to measure it, that we know what information is needed, how we're going to apply it, and all these functions that go into a PRD. We have 2 teams that build the logic itself, the business logic, if you think about it from a software perspective. And it's basically the data engineering team that basically is responsible for pulling data, all the ETL jobs, and generating the data models and so on. And the other team is the data science team. We're in the build stage. We're doing some change management there. And these 2 teams create the applications themselves. And these are the data products, right? What is a data product? The data product at the end of the day is a data model in Snowflake. It's an API endpoint from an ML perspective. It's different types of products that fall into different categories, either analytics-based or just descriptive data points that go and are being activated in some applications. It can be Tableau can be an activation layer. It can be a data point in Salesforce. It can be a data point in your marketing automation platform. It can be an endpoint like a ML model that's being utilized in some decision process on the go-to-market side. So there's different areas where you do the activation, but the data product is a variety of things that we just described. And the data science and data engineering team are the teams that are building that. Yeah. There's another team of data analysts. We are in a hub-spoke model, so the analysts in our org sit both in the business units themselves. So that's what makes the data pod an augmented data pod. So we're there with them. We are trying to give them the support they need, but we try to execute together as an org, even though it's a hub-spoke model. There are challenges with there. There's a lot of benefits with that as well. The fact that the data analyst and the business analyst are close to the business gives them a lot of the SME knowledge that probably would be more difficult in the world where it was all centralized. So that's the 13. And all of this sits on top of 2 additional layers, which is the data governance team. We have a great leader, Anne. She's doing amazing work building out her practices around data governance and how do we ensure that data quality is a good place. And I think we're not the most important, but one of the most important layers is the data platform team, the enterprise data platform team. Igor is leading that function and also doing a great job. And that's basically all the set of tools that we provide both for our hub and our spokes to enable to do data and analytics at our company.
Got it. Okay, so there's the PM layer, there's the business logic, which is data eng plus data science. There are the data analysts that are distributed, federated, or seconded. And then the last 2 layers, data governance, which is around control, security, regulation. And then the last is the data platform, which is the common tools across the entire company that people can use in order to analyze data. Those are the 5 layers of the cake.
Correct.
Right? Really cool. And maybe going back to the first one, the PMs, you talked about this data PRD. How different is a data PRD from a software engineering PRD?
I think it's pretty similar. I think there's nuances in data. I think if I think about software, like until the data era, software teams and product teams would be focusing on the value that we're trying to bring to the business and have some discussions on the business logic or the experience that we're trying to create, right? That's usually how do I as a user interact with that system. I think with data, it's a similar concept. You think at the end of the day, you have a user that's going to be using this data in different ways. And there is basically how does the team generate that data or the data product to enable them. in most cases, it would be similar. I think the areas where things are different is that data has a quality that where usually it doesn't have. And what I'm talking about is stochastic versus deterministic type of property, which makes it very hard, right? Companies like Monte Carlo and others exist because the data it's not really its own life. But when you deploy a set of code into production, the code is static until you replace it. The functionality is it's very static. There's no dynamic part to it. Whereas data, when you deploy it, because of the number of data producers, number of consumers, the processors in the middle that play around with the data, and because of so many dependencies between the different teams, makes it more of a dynamic beast. And I think in the world of data, you have to treat data as a dynamic beast, and with that, have the guardrails in place. So governance is not a piece that is like a nice to have. I think given the fact that there's so many people who touch the data, and I can talk, for example, from a product perspective, think about all the events that we collect. Every software company has a product, there's engagements with our product. These engagements are being collected not by a data analyst team. They're being collected by a producer on the product side, usually an apps engineer data. They're not data experts, but that data is critical for us as a business to drive value. So the utilization of our company, of how they utilize the data, how our users utilize these features, all of that is critical to understand of how we're doing as a business. And that means that from that perspective, we need to make sure that we enable these teams to do their work without spending too much time being data experts, and having the governance in place to make sure that the quality of the data that is being generated on the producer side is not contaminating that dynamic environment of the data. So I think that quality is very unique to data that doesn't exist in the software world. In the software world, everything is defined and set. And once you deploy something, it's what you defined. Compared to a world where I think the last era of LLMs is a great example. The hallucinations is something, it's not deterministic, it's stochastic. Right. So what do you do in that world where, and that's the real world, everything is stochastic, but in code, in regular software products that you build, it's more deterministic and it's easier to predict.
It's a really good nuance that you point out. And because like data volumes can change, systems, API systems or upstream systems can go down. You can lose data, the shape of the data changes, the volume might change, the underlying quality might change. That's why this governance role is so important. If I think about that PRD, is there a section where the governance is anticipated ahead of the development of the product? What you do expect in terms of data volumes and disaster recovery plans or fallback plans, does that exist there, or is that outside the scope of the PRD?
No, it's also in the PRD. And I think there's two sides to this. So the DPRD is, I like to think about it in a system way. So there's basically different microservices, which are people, right, and there's APIs between these people. So the PRD or the DPRD is the API between the business, your customer, and the data and analytics team. So that's where you define the API. You try to identify what you're trying to build. Now, in that DPRD, there's sections for almost any practitioner in that data group. They get to go inside. It's not owned by the DPM. DPM help facilitate it, but the ownership is across the data pod of the people I just described, who jump in and start asking questions because they have, each of them, depends on the data product you're trying to build, will have responsibility. There's in a lot of cases, maybe the data scientist won't be part of it because the data scientist only is part of specific data products that are being built. But in most cases, the data pod in its entirety will join the DPRD and start with Google Doc or something like that. It helps you do it in an async manner, so you don't have to have 50 meetings talk about it. It's something that people usually don't do, and I'm not very good at it either. But the DPRD as a concept is something that allows you to democratize the access to the definition and allow you to be heard without having to have a meeting where you all talk about it.
That makes sense.
Now,
that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and now so that's the API between the business and the data analytics team. I think there's now an API internally between the data analytics team and the data analytics team. What I mean by that is there's these different personas of people who operate in that org, and they all have a responsibility from an SOP perspective on how they're going to be delivering that product at the end of the day. And I think what happens is, we can talk about the SOPs in a sec, but from a technical perspective, usually is something, and again, we're in the midst, we've done it before at other companies, but here we're building it up here at ZoomInfo as we speak. That's something that's called a TP, a technical execution plan, and that's an API internally to make sure that the design and the architecture of what you're building makes sense and we can sign off of it and make sure that we're all aligned on how we're executing on it. Now, as you can assume, there's costs to doing these things.
That means through two acronyms that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah.
So technical execution plan, and you called it an ASOP.
Oh, SOP.
I know it's standard operating procedure.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, SOP. Sorry, I didn't. Yeah, the SOP. Yeah. Okay. And this falls into the process side, right? We talked about people, back to the macro framework, people, process, product, and tech stack. So in the process side, we have these DPRDs as a place to agree, come to an agreement on what we're trying to build from a business perspective. And the TP is the technical execution plan of how do we do it to basically align the internal technical teams that that's the design, that's the architecture, that's how we're going to build it across the different functionalities. And the data governance team should be plugged into that era as well. So they understand the requirements from a business perspective. They give some insights, but from an execution perspective, you need to make sure that we're customers of Monte Carlo. So for Monte Carlo, we need to make sure that we have the monitoring and alerting in place. And what do we expect people to do when an alert comes up, which also is not something that is given out of the bottom. So hopefully that makes sense.
Could we spend just a second? So that data governance function, that word governance is super amorphous.
Yeah.
It means so many different things, right? There's like regulatory compliance, there's security, there's access control. What does it mean in your world?
Yeah, so there's the definition and where we're at in the journey. So everything is a journey, and let's talk about what does it mean, and then we can talk about where we're in the journey. So in my mind, data governance lists all the things that you just mentioned, but in general, it's the quality of the data, who gets access to the data, and again, this is not from a centralized management perspective, but from a policies definition perspective. So in the Atlassian world, it would be an SLO, so like service level ownership side, that you provide policies and guidelines of how you want it to be done, but you find a way to implement it into the process of the development side of things. So how do you develop? Again, we don't want to be blockers. I think data analytics teams in a lot of cases play this weird role where they're either in the middle of things and they make it hard for people to execute their work, or they're too far away and they're not part of these processes. I think the sweet spot in the middle is the interesting piece, is how do you provide governance in a way that is decentralized and automated. And like the tech stack is so important here, because you don't want people to follow some like Google Doc that tells them what to do step by step. In part of their development process, there should be something that is automated that allows them to apply these data governance rules as part of it. But back to the definition, I would say is access control of the data quality itself, which is again another loaded. What is data quality? We can go down that path. And what is the SOP around alerting and monitoring? And because in a lot of cases, governance talks about alerting and monitoring of policies that were broken in the organization for data. So if we expect a certain data, there's a data contract between, let's say, for data product X, we have a certain data contract. That data contract says that for a certain column, we have only these values. If a new value comes in, it should trigger an alert. The alert should go somewhere where people know what to do with it. We should make sure that we're not blockers. So if the alert is coming from the producer, we should just know the producer that there's an issue, and we're not going to contaminate the data until that problem is fixed. So all of this needs to be as part of that data governance practice, also from a people, process, and a tech stack perspective, to meet those requirements. And they're being done in different areas. And we're in that journey today at ZoomInfo, we're somewhere in the middle, I would say.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about how data can be stochastic. You have a column that's supposed to have a date, and all of a sudden has a bunch of Booleans in it. And the SOP says, okay, you have to alert somebody. Do you treat those as bugs? Are you using Jira in order to capture? How do you, and then if I'm downstream, so if I am consuming a data data product from somebody that's broken, how do I stay up to date on when it's been fixed and when I can go back and reincorporate that data?
Two great questions. So in general, the Jira approach, I think, is the right approach. At the end of the day, there's two main areas where you generate data, either the engineering teams under R&D or the enterprise applications team under the go-to-market that leads to your Salesforce development, your Marketo development, all the work that is your SAPs, whatever you'd like. So in a perfect world, it goes through Jira. Today, we do it through Slack. Not optimal. We're building out that function as we speak. But it means that every contract violation that we have in the system, we create a bug for the respective team based on where the data comes from. And remember, our approach is we want to stay away from being a bottleneck for this. And we want to scale, and we don't want our team to scale one-to-one for any new software product that we onboard. We don't want to bring another person to manage it from a manual perspective. We want to think about it in an automated practice. So that's how we are planning on managing today. Today's through Slack. We're trying to upload it to move it to Jira, basically to create every contract violation goes into Jira and goes to the respective teams. Now, back to your point about, which I think is a bit tied to the active approach that Atlan is going with and other companies as well. What we're trying to do, and we have pieces of it already, but I think there's a bigger initiative for 2024, is something that we call Heartbeat. And Heartbeat is basically the key product or data product that we're trying to build to map out the entire set of data products in the org, define the priority of it, right? Because today, if there's an issue with a pipeline, if it's a P4 versus a P0, we should treat it differently. That definition doesn't exist today, and we want to define that properly. And there's two ways to define it, and the approach we're taking is qualitative, is go like a Slack bot goes to Tom and asks him, hey, Tom, we know you own these 4 tables in Snowflake. How important are they? And you get that information in one way. The other way, which I think a platform team has a great responsibility and a great ability to do, is look at usage. There's people that, like we have cases where people think that a data product is super important, and then we see that there was no access in the last 180 days. Why would you invest time in think about all the compute that Snowflake was spending on Snowflake to create it? Should be defined is how do you hold users of the platform accountable for all of the usage that they're doing and no value that's being provided. And I think teams that have microservices that live there and you spend,
So I think the data mesh or whatever you want to call it, I think is basically a parallel for microservices where you have individual teams that are responsible for small components and together, like the Transformers or Captain Planet, they come together and they're stronger as a result of collaborating. In the architecture that you describe, where the production of the data is distributed amongst teams, is it easy to motivate teams to fix bugs with a reasonable level of cadence, with a reasonable level of speed? And I guess this is like part of the broader question, is it hard to convince an organization to structure themselves in this way and then align the motivations and the incentives so that it works?
I think so it's a hard process because it's new and people don't like new usually. They're used to something and they're doing it. But I think if the story is being told from a way of how it's impacting the business, if you can tie the work that you do, then that's what we're trying to do with the work we're doing here at ZoomInfo is most of the work that we're trying to do, we're trying to tie it to business outcomes, either on the product side or on the go-to-market side. If you're trying to make something happen and you're trying to build a data product, we try to tie that to the business value, and it also helps with the prioritization. Think about where we spend our time. I can sit here for an hour and there's probably 100 people in the org that thought about new ideas that we should work on. But what is the important idea we should work on? It also ties to the prioritization and the priority from like a CI perspective in the data world, right? If something fails in one of the data products that we build, how do we know it's important? What's the SLA for it? So when we start asking these questions, again, it takes me back to the beginning of this conversation where we said, how do you know that what you're doing is impactful and important? How do you measure it? And I think there needs, in the data world today, I don't think there's a standardized way of how people measure the value of the data products that they build. And being able to capture that priority based on usage and based on some other qualitative metrics is, I think, the approach where you basically you accept the world where you don't control all the data that's being generated in the company. You don't control the initiatives that are being worked on. But what you, I think, should be doing is looking at a list of things that are being worked on and say, here's the areas where there's highest ROI. Let's go focus on those. And for all other areas, let's provide the ICs, either business people or product people or the data analysts and the spokes, the ability to do the work that they need to do without blocking them and allow them to iterate and do the amazing work they do. And if they find gold, to go and help them make it a production level data product.
So how do you, and I don't know if this is a fair question because I don't know if there's an answer to it, but how do you think about defining value as a data leader? Is it, like you mentioned, right? One way is how many minutes are spent looking at this particular analysis, right? Another way might be the use of this machine learning algorithm reduced overall cost in this particular function by X. And it seems the metric could be defined within the PRD and they are bespoke to each product. Is that right? Each data product?
Yeah, it's similar. Again, we're not inventing here anything. The software companies have solved this for years. They have a head start of about 30 years to it or something like that. And they've already figured this out. Like MAU and DAO is not something that we invented, but why can it be used for data products, right? If you have a table that lives in Snowflake, if you can measure the MAU and DAO of it and you can see that it's 0, why would you invest compute resources to it, people resources to it? There's a lot of things that we spend our money on today And I think it talks a bit about the way these software tools sell their value. A lot of it is usage-based, but who says that the usage that we're executing in Snowflake has a high ROI on it? I don't know. And I think these questions that we need to ask, we need to find a way to do it in a programmatic, have an army of 50 analysts to go and figure out what is the ROI of it, but build some. And Heartbeat is basically our approach to solve it is let's build a product that helps us answer these questions, run in the background and help us manage all of that mayhem for us to focus on the critical things that are top priorities and let that system take care of all of the governance, which is also part of it. Yeah.
And so like MaoDAO, that's something, are you looking in the logs? Is that where you,
yeah,
in order to, yeah, anywhere where you can find access to that data, you calculate that ratio?
I think the benefit of data teams today, and depends on the tech stack, I think it'd be solved for areas where it's on-prem. But because most companies today, the way they operate is that they buy a lot of tools off the rack. That's exactly what you do, Tom, is you look at a lot of data and AI companies. And so we buy those companies as organizations across the world. And those are, the great part about it is a lot of these products today that are being used by data practitioners or by business stakeholders all have logs and usage information in different types, right? So query history in Snowflake, that gives me who did something, what did they do, what's the query, how long did it take, how much did it cost. I have more visibility than most SaaS product companies on what my teams do with the data without me even needing to be there. Like I have that from a platform perspective, have full visibility to anyone who's using what and how they're using it. And from a governance perspective, I can have full visibility without ever talking to the person.
That's really cool. There's Heartbeat, which sounds like an incredible product. One of the questions from the audience that we collected ahead of time was, are there tools that you use today that don't quite work because they don't take into account the stochastic nature of data, or the fact that like there's code and data, that like in a machine learning model, you have a particular run and there's data and code at a particular point in time that you need both in order to reproduce. Do you find that's the case, or are most software development tools actually pretty effective within the scope of data product development?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think, like the answer is probably somewhere between yes or no. So some tools take that into accountability, some tools don't. I don't think that's a property that is defined as critical for all the data, for all the SaaS tools that we use today. Behavior and property of data that we spoke about, the fact that it's stochastic means that at any point of time, T0, T1, T2, the data changes, the way the distribution changes, everything changes. And then the question is, why do you care about a valid question is, why do you care if it changes? Like, why is that property important? Why are you bringing it up? Because that property is the main thing that changes the discussion from what can we do with the data, more of a SaaS product or a data product, looks at the data and wants to know that the quality of the data is high, and they don't want to ask themselves, is this correct or not? Is this valid? Why is there a spike? In most cases, there's two buckets. Either there's real business behavior or there's a data issue. We want to take the data issue bucket and bring it to zero so people don't ask themselves, we don't want meetings to be spent 20% of the time asking, is the data correct? But talking that reducing it will allow us to control for these variables and hopefully bring them down to zero.
Okay, one more question from the audience. Suppose I have a data team of 10 people today that is not structured this way. How do I take the first 2 or 3 steps to move in this direction? It'll be company specific, but do I start to specialize people? Do I communicate this to the management team? What advice would you give to somebody?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it depends on the size of the company. If we were a startup of 20 people, I would treat this differently. I don't think this operating structure works. It would be even a data product market. So I think in that world, you're still in discovery stages. You're building the basics. In that world, if the data team is there as part of a smaller startup that is moving fast, then I think what I just described is going to be harder to implement. Although I still think there's a way to make it work, bringing like a data product manager, a data analyst, data scientist, data engineer, a platform engineer, and putting them together and maybe expanding the teams based on the ratios. There is a healthy ratio, similar to the product world, right? Engineers, right? One product manager to 6 to 8 engineers. You should think about it in the data world as well. Because at the end of the day, for example, you see a lot of companies where there's hundreds of analysts creating hundreds of outcomes, but there's no team behind it to productionalize all of that work. And then the question becomes, are these basically people who are doing a lot of discovery and one of those will become important and to meet all of their requirements. I think in most cases, it'll be the latter, which basically we let people run and dig holes and try to find some gold, but only a few will find it, and we focus our efforts on those few. So in that world, you can operate in both in the current state, which I just described, or in a way that is less structured. But I think if you care about the real value that you're bringing to the company, which I think is important, it's hard to measure for data org. The people like a DPM will help you validate that what you're doing is important. Where in cases where the engineering teams, like the data engineering team or the data analyst team or data scientist team, talks directly to the business, that dimension from the data product development lifecycle is missing, and then you're basically executing based on HIPPO, like the highest paying person's opinion.
Yeah.
So
disaster.
Yeah.
Awesome. We have a real-time question from the audience, which is, given the stochastic nature of data, Philip, would you provide your insight into the testing processes of data products prior to release?
That's another loaded question. There's the prescriptive approach where you define things very neatly in your CI/CD pipelines or as part of your data engineering practices or any other practice, or you go down the path of defining it by monitoring the data. So basically what I'm saying, you either monitor the business logic or you monitor the data. And I think companies like Monte Carlo, for example, went down the path of, I don't care about the business logic, at least for now. I don't care about the business logic. What I care about is the data, and any change in the data I want to capture. One of the challenges, it's a great tool, we use it internally, but one of the challenges with that approach is that you can only take care of the fire once it's started. But you want to prevent the fire from happening. And how you do that, usually that's where an approach is the business logic. There's other approaches as well. So it's a loaded question. And I think that currently the best answer that I have is that you monitor the data. The business logic piece is there's companies that are being built as we speak to try to solve it at the business logic level. But I think the closer you can move to the producer side and capture these challenges on the producer side, the better, because the stochastic side, the stochastic property of the data and the data product is a result of the fact that you are not the one who's generating the data. You're just consuming it or processing it. And the more you can capture that at a producer side and prevent it there, the better. So like an initiative that we're doing, and we talked about it with Amplitude, we talked about it with some other vendors, the approach the path we're trying to take internally is how do we prevent at the apps engineering level from data contracts to not be violated? Because currently the data contract is executed in the warehouse, but that's not good enough because the data was already contaminated. I have nothing to do at this point other than go and try to fix it versus trying to push it upstream. And I think, and this is the piece that is probably the most challenging to do at a company, is how do you come to agreement with the CTO or the CPO or both that the issues that are happening in data are not, my team can spend 40% of their time fixing data issues. But if we don't hold the engineering team accountable for the work that is being done, and if they introduce bugs without thinking about this, and we don't have a way to govern that any change that they make is going to impact downstream data product, and then we're going to be stuck in a world where we're cleaning all day.
Yeah, that's right. So Ideally, the ultimate end state is you have some sort of a control system at the output of the producer before it gets into the cloud data warehouse. And then you have a monitoring system in order to catch anything else downstream.
So it's a combined approach. So the monitoring is in place right now to help identify fires that started. Right. The approach that we're doing right now related to event monitoring and event capturing and governance of these events, like from schema evolution to schema validation to other properties that we need to be captured at the producer side, that basically tries to prevent the fires from starting in the first place. So basically in the CI/CD pipeline, when the front engineer or the backend engineer or your Salesforce developer tries to roll out something into production, they get notified that they're breaking the contract. And like in a world where data becomes even a stronger player at a company's organizational structure, it will prevent them from doing it. So you'll have to get an approval.
The CI/CD flow. You failed the integration test effectively.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and again, the governance piece of what is the event structure, what is the valid values, that's something that is defined from a data governance perspective. But when I say that, it doesn't mean that only the data governance team can go and define those events. we need to enable data practitioners and not just business stakeholders. If a product team wants to release a feature, they shouldn't be dependent on my team to go and do that. They should have the set of tools and the best practices in place to do it on their own and have the capability. And for that data governance lead to define what that policy looks like.
Awesome. Okay, one more question from Guha in the audience here. We've been talking a lot about data quality. Given that data alerts are highly diverse, you can have missing data, bad data, incorrect semantics, incorrect context. How do you set up the observability to be able to manage those different diversity of alerts?
And great question. And I think it takes us back to Heartbeat. If Heartbeat knows what is the priority of a product, then you treat it like, why does the data engineer jump in the middle of a dashboard that wasn't touched in the last 4 years failed? I don't think that's a valid expectation. And these see the priority of a data product and all the underlying assets, right? Because you think about the data product can be a dashboard that is being used by your CEO to measure attainment of the sales organization, like that you're meeting the goals that you're trying to meet. And let's say that's a critical data product. We treat it as a P0. If the dashboard itself or any of the underlying assets, including the tables, the data producers, is broken, we need a way to capture it, and we need a way to class it. So if that data product is a P0, then all of the underlying tables are a P0. So any breakage or any bug in those underlying assets that is impacting a P0 product, which means the SLA should be very quick. But there's other data products like data products that are P4s because the users are a data analyst uses once a week and there's not a lot of outcomes to drive out of it, then that can be solved in a week or in 2 weeks. That's where priority comes into play. And that's the only way for us to, the great part of working in a software company, which I love being part of, is that we think about what is important and what's not. And not everything that even I propose or anyone else proposes is important. We think it is important. We might try to make a case, but if it's not being used and at the end of it, there are users, if no one uses it, then why waste the time to build it or to maintain it?
I think that summarizes the conversation really well, Philip. I learned 3 things from our conversation. The first is the whole idea of like data products and data product management, data engineering teams is real. It's working. You developed it. The second, we talked through the 5-layer cake of the data team and the roles and responsibilities, and particularly how critical that PRD is in order to align everybody within the data team on how to build it. And then the third is, and I think you captured it beautifully, which is unlike code, there's a stochastic nature to data where you're building software that's dependent upon potentially really chaotic inputs that can lead to really chaotic outputs. And that changes a lot of the way that data teams need to operate. It's probably the biggest change of a data engineering team compared to a software engineering team.
Yep.
Yeah. Awesome. So Philip, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today. This was phenomenally interesting to me, and I'd like to thank our audience. I hope you found the conversation as insightful as I did. Philip, we really appreciate your time. Thanks for sharing your insights, and we wish you a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Tom. This was great. Great conversation.
It's a pleasure. All right. See you later, everyone.